She stumbled into the barn just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Dress torn, bare feet, bleeding from the cold, and breath ragged like the wind itself. The scent of hay and horse sweat filled her lungs, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt safe, a strange, impossible promise. Outside, the dust of riders stirred across the trail, searching, relentless. She pressed herself behind the stacked bales, whispering to the empty shadows, "Just for tonight." The barn door creaked, and a shadow filled the frame. A man, broad as the winter sky, paused, quiet but watching. His presence made her heart pound, yet offered a fragile sort of hope she didn't dare name. Could she trust him? Or would the world catch up before morning, in a land where law and cruelty rode fast, and fear whispered on every wind? Sometimes salvation came from the unlikeliest of strangers, and sometimes survival meant stepping into the unknown, into a pair of hands that could protect or destroy. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. The first thing that hit her was the dust-hot, metallic, clinging to her throat as she ran. It rose behind her bare feet in thin, frantic clouds, catching the last burnt orange light of the Nevada sky. Late autumn in 1883 had a sharp way of reminding folks how small they really were. The air was thin, dry as bone, and the wind carried nothing but the sound of its own kind of warning. Nora Elridge didn't dare look back. If she did, she feared her legs would stop moving, and if they stopped, she knew what waited for her: a wagon, a chain, and a life she'd never chosen. Her left wrist throbbed with every stride. The skin there was scraped raw where an iron shackle had been, hours earlier, broken loose only because she'd rammed it against the corner of a feed trough until the hinge snapped. Every heartbeat sent a pulse of pain through her arm, but pain was nothing compared to what she was running from. The wagon road stretched ahead, like a strip of fading gold. Sagebrush on both sides rattled in the wind, whispering secrets she didn't have time to hear. Her breath came out in thin, broken strands, each one cut short by the ache in her ribs. Clutched tight against her chest was a small cloth bundle, her mother's locket wrapped inside torn Bible pages. She felt it with every step, the only proof she still belonged to herself. Behind her, faint at first, came the echo of men's voices, not laughing, not talking, calling, searching. She pushed harder. The flashbacks came the way lightning does, sharp, sudden, without warning. Her stepfather's voice, flat, cold, reeking of whiskey. "It settles the debt, Elias. Girl's strong enough. You get a worker, I get my ledger cleared, papers rustling, a signature that wasn't hers." Elias Crane's hand closing around her arm the first time. The grip too tight to be mistaken for anything but ownership. Her mother's locket slipping from her collar into her palm, the only softness in that room. Then the sound of a bolt sliding into place. She shook her head, gasping. The road blurred. The world narrowed to breath and fear. Somewhere far ahead, she spotted it, a dark shape against the fading sky. A ranch house, squat and weathered, leaning under a lonely cottonwood tree. A small barn hunched beside it, its roof sagging a little, but standing steady against the wind. A single thread of smoke drifted from the chimney, pale as a ghost. The sight hit her like water in a desert. If she could reach it, if she could get out of sight, maybe she'd have till morning. Maybe the night would hide her. Her knees buckled as she left the road and plunged into brush. Sage tore at her skirt. Goat heads bit into the soft skin of her feet. She stumbled more than she ran now, half falling, half catching herself on brittle stems until the ground finally dipped and she nearly rolled into the clearing behind the barn. The horses inside stirred. She heard them shifting, snorting, the steady, living warmth of them calling to her in a way she'd never understood before. Please, she whispered more to her own shaking legs than to anyone listening. She gripped the heavy barn door, pulled it. It groaned but moved, opening just wide enough for her thin body. Warm, dusky air met her like a blanket. Hay dust floated in golden streaks through the dimness. The smell, earthy. Safe, hit her so hard she almost cried. She waited, listening. No voices, no boots. Just the creak of beams settling and a horse pawing at the straw. She slipped inside. Her whole body sagged as she pushed the door, mostly closed behind her. Not shut. She didn't have the strength, but enough to hide her from any casual glance. She moved on trembling hands and knees across the packed dirt, weaving between stalls until she reached the back corner, where a stack of hay, bales, stood like a small fortress. She squeezed herself behind them, curling tight, forehead against her knees. Her breath made soft, white puffs in the cold air. The pounding in her ears was so loud she couldn't tell if the hoofbeats outside were real or imagined. Her lips were cracked, almost numb. She closed her eyes, whispering through them, "Just tonight, just tonight." The barn swayed softly in the wind. Horses shifted in their stalls, snuffling as though curious about the small stranger hiding among them. Outside, the world kept moving, a distant rumble of hooves, a call carried by the breeze, men searching, following, hunting. Her vision tunneled. The cold of the dirt seeped into her bones, mingling with the exhaustion that finally overwhelmed fear. The bundle under her arm felt heavier, her mother's locket pressing into her ribs like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. Just tonight. She breathed again, weaker this time. Then darkness. She didn't hear the footsteps. She didn't see the lantern glow spilling across the barn floor. She didn't catch the shift of shadow stretching long across the hay, but she felt the air change, felt the temperature shift as someone very large stepped inside. Boots thudded once, twice, slow and certain against the earth. They stopped near the center of the barn. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the lantern flickered, catching on a tall figure, broad shoulders. Coat dusty from miles of work, hat brim low enough to hide most of his face. He stood still as a tree trunk, listening, sensing something out of place. His shadow stretched all the way to her hiding spot. The horses didn't panic. They turned their heads, watching him with the kind of trust only earned by quiet hands. He took one more step, and in the dim amber light, he saw what didn't belong, the faint imprint of small bare feet in the dust, leading toward the back stall. He followed them. His boots stopped just a few feet from her, breath steady, posture alert. He didn't speak. He only lowered the lantern a little, letting its glow reach behind the hay. There. He saw a girl curled tight as a fawn, dress torn, skin scraped, dirt smudged across her cheek. She didn't wake. He exhaled, slow and deep, a sound halfway between surprise and something softer, something like an old ache stirring. Outside, hooves echoed faintly on the far road. Inside, the giant cowboy stood in silence, lantern trembling ever so slightly in his hand, staring at the stranger who'd hidden herself in his barn. And as the wind moaned against the boards, he whispered the first words she never heard. "Lord, help me." Because trouble had come to his doorstep, wrapped in dust and desperation. And he knew the night was far from over. Dawn crept slow across the Nevada plain, the kind of morning that didn't bother with colors, just a thin wash of pale blue spreading over frost-silvered grass. The windmill beside the well turned with a tired groan, blades scraping against the cold. Nothing hurried here, not the sun, not the wind, not the man standing alone on the porch with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. Silas Boone stared out at the cottonwood tree, its last leaves trembling in the early chill. Most men in Dry Creek said he liked that tree more than he liked people. They weren't entirely wrong. Trees didn't ask questions. Trees didn't dredge up things he tried to bury. Steam rose from his cup. His breath rose with it. He wasn't thinking about much he rarely did at this hour. Mornings were the only time the world felt quiet enough to match him inside. But then a sound reached him. Soft, thin, wrong, a rustle from the barn. Not the horses. Not the usual shifting, snorting, chewing. This was a softer scrape, like fabric, or a body trying to move without being heard. Silas set his cup on the porch rail. The air around him seemed to tighten. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He walked across the yard, boots crunching over the thin frost, each step measured as if not to disturb whatever might be waiting inside. When he pulled the barn door open, a draft of warm, animal-scented air met him. Horses flicked their ears at his arrival, their calm a sign that nothing dangerous lurked inside. That narrowed the possibilities but didn't settle anything. He moved deeper, eyes adjusting to the dim. Dust drifted lazily in the shafts of morning light poking through the boards. Everything looked as it always did, tack hanging from pegs, hay stacked high, the mare shifting softly in her stall. Then he saw her, curled small behind the last pile of bales, hair tangled, face streaked with dirt. A girl, no, barely a woman wrapped around herself like someone expecting a blow. Her dress was torn, bare feet mottled with cold, one wrist angry red and swollen, the skin split from something that had held her far too tight. Silas's breath left him in a slow exhale, not of surprise, more like recognition. Trouble often arrived, looking this small. He crouched beside her, careful not to startle the horses. Her lips were cracked, breath shallow. He touched 2 fingers to her neck, not unkind, not lingering, just checking for life. A faint pulse fluttered beneath his touch. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, she jerked awake. Her eyes snapped wide with raw, animal fear. She scrambled backward, hitting the barn wall so hard dust shook loose from the rafters. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. "Easy," Silas said, voice low, steady. The kind of voice that made horses settle. "You'll hurt yourself." "Don't," her voice cracked. "Don't come any closer." He raised both hands, palms out, as if calming a spooked foal. He wasn't a man who wasted words, especially on strangers. But fear like hers didn't leave room for silence. "You're in my barn," he said softly. "That's all I know." She swallowed, chest heaving. I got lost." "Lost?" he repeated, not mocking, just weighing the lie in the air between them. His gaze flicked down to her wrist. The scar told a different story. She followed his eyes, then pulled her arm against her chest like a shield. Silas didn't push, didn't demand a name or explanation. Life out here taught a few simple truths, one of them being people run for a reason. "You came far," he asked. "Far enough," she whispered. He nodded once, slowly. That was all the answer he needed for now. "You're safe from the night," he said. "After that, we'll see." Her eyes flickered confusion, suspicion, a hint of something like hope buried deep. Without another word, he stood and crossed to a trunk pushed against the wall. He rummaged through it and pulled out an old wool blanket, frayed at the edges but clean. He came back with careful steps and draped it over her shoulders without touching her skin. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at him like she expected the blanket to turn into a trap. Silas set a tin cup of water beside her on the hay. "Drink slow," he murmured. Then he did something she didn't expect. He stepped back, walked to the door, and left it cracked open behind him. Not shut, not locked. He wasn't caging her. For a man built like a mountain, that small mercy felt impossibly gentle. Outside, the wind caught the door slightly, making it sway. Silas paused on the threshold, glancing back only once. There was no softness in his face, but there was something steadier and understanding shaped by miles of solitude and things he didn't speak about. In the small cabin beyond the barn, Silas washed his hands in the basin, the cold water stinging the old scar that split across his knuckles. On a narrow shelf above the washstand sat a woman's locket closed, dusty, untouched for years. Beside it, a folded Union Army jacket, blue faded to gray. When he shrugged out of his shirt, the early light caught the long pale scar across his back, the kind left by a blade swung with purpose. He dressed again, slow and deliberate, as if gathering himself. When he stepped outside, the morning had sharpened. The frost glittered like broken glass. He carried a bucket toward the trough, already thinking through what a stranger might need: food, warmth, time, not answers. But then he heard it, the faint jingle of tack, the clatter of riders coming down the main road. He stopped cold. The horses were still too far to see, but close enough for the ground to carry their weight. Silas turned his head, not toward the road, but toward the barn. Toward the girl hidden inside, toward whatever story she wasn't ready to say. He let out a slow, steady breath, the kind that came before decisions a man couldn't take back. Then he walked to the back pasture gate, the one that showed the easiest set of tracks leading toward his ranch. And he quietly locked it. The rider's noise grew louder. The cottonwood leaves rattled like dry bones. Silas Boone straightened to his full height, the early sun catching the edges of his shadow across the frost, and muttered under his breath, "Looks like trouble found me again." But this time, he wasn't planning to hand trouble over. He turned toward the road, boots crunching, shoulders set, a silent wall rising between the girl and whoever was coming for her. And the day hadn't even begun. Mid-morning arrived with a thin haze of dust drifting across the yard, the kind that clung to clothes and made the horizon look farther than it really was. Silas Boone had just finished checking the trough when he heard it, the rhythmic thud of hooves beating a steady, unfriendly pattern against the hard Nevada earth. Riders. Not travelers. Not neighbors. Trouble. He didn't blink, didn't curse. He simply lifted his head as 3 horses crested the rise near his gate, their riders sitting tall like they had business here and nowhere else. Their coats were too fine for cowhands, too stiff for ranchers. City men pretending to belong in the dust, and on their boots, beneath the neat stitching and polished leather, lay a thin crust of road, powder men who'd been riding since dawn. Cranes men, inside the barn. Nora heard it too. She stiffened, her fingers gripping the blanket Silas had given her, knuckles white as bone. The voices carried through the cracks in the boards, echoing in her chest more than her ears. Boone, one man shouted, "We're looking for someone." Silas stepped out from the shadow of the house and walked toward the gate, with the slow, unhurried gait of a man who refused to be rushed by anything short of God himself. He stopped just shy of the fence. "What is it you want?" he asked. The lead rider, a narrow-faced man with a fox-like squint, raised his chin. Girl, barefoot, dark hair, scar on her wrist, ran off from a property she had no business leaving. "You seen her?" Silas didn't move. Nora pressed herself flatter against the barn wall, breath shallow, each inhale a silent prayer. She knew they'd drag her back, even if she kicked, screamed, bled. The law, the paper, her stepfather. They all stood behind the men outside. Men like Elias Crane never came hunting without both money and arrogance on their side. Silas finally answered, "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that." "She might be hidin'," another rider said, scanning the yard. "Girls get scared, crawl into places like barns. Maybe you ought to let us take a look." Silas didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for his gun. He just stared at the man until the rider shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "No one's rummaging through my property," Silas said. "Not unless you've got a warrant from the fort." "You got one." A pause. Tight, resentful. The lead rider spat into the dirt. "We got questions." "That's enough." Silas didn't answer. He simply turned his head toward the barn. Nora's heart stopped. He was walking toward her. Every instinct told her to bolt out the back, run until her legs shredded. But she stayed behind the hay, trembling, waiting for whatever came next. Silas stepped inside the dim barn, closed the door behind him but didn't latch it. His boots approached slow, steady. When he reached her hiding place, he crouched, lowering himself to her level. She couldn't see his face clearly, just the brim of his hat and the calmness in his breath. Then he spoke, not loud, not urgent, just certain. "If they ask who you are?" His eyes softened, not with pity, but with a strange kind of respect. "You're my wife now. Just nod. Just stand by me." Nora's lips parted. She stared at him like she hadn't understood the words. I don't." She shook her head. "Why would you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he extended his hand, large, calloused, surprisingly steady. She hesitated only a moment before placing her trembling fingers into his palm. His grip wasn't tight, just enough to anchor her. He helped her rise, her legs unsteady beneath her. Her hair was wild around her shoulders, the blanket draped loosely like a shawl. She looked like someone halfway between being found and being lost. But Silas didn't seem ashamed to stand beside her. "Come on," he said quietly. Together they walked toward the barn door. He didn't lead her by force, just guided her with the quiet certainty of a man who'd made up his mind. Outside, the riders straightened in their saddles, eyes narrowing. Silas positioned himself beside her, resting her hand on his forearm like a husband might when presenting his wife. His other hand dropped casually, almost lazily, near the butt of the revolver, holstered at his hip. "This is my wife," he said. "She's been here all night. Ask the horses, they'll back me up." One of the men snorted. "That right." Mrs. Gaze crawled over her, searching for weakness. "You want to come home now? We'll take you where you belong." A tremor ran through her spine. Her throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Her mind screamed, "Run, hide, disappear," but her body stayed frozen. Silas shifted just slightly, enough for her to feel the steady weight of his arm beneath her hand, a borrowed courage, a borrowed name, a borrowed place to stand. Nora swallowed hard. Her voice came thin but clear. "My home's here." Silas didn't move, didn't react, but something in the air changed subtle, like a string pulled taut. The fox-eyed leader narrowed his gaze. "Boone?" You're making trouble you don't need, Silas answered with the calm of a man who refused to be intimidated by noise. You've had your look. Time to ride on. The men stared a beat, too long, weighing their options. Then the leader jerked his reins. Crane ain't gonna quit, he warned. Better hope that girl's worth what's comin'. They turned, boots scraping stirrups, horses kicking dust into the morning light. Within moments, they were nothing but distant silhouettes dissolving into the horizon. The instant they disappeared, Nora's knees buckled. She would have fallen if Silas hadn't stepped back, just enough to keep her upright without grabbing her. He didn't touch her, didn't ask if she was all right. He simply said, in that low and steady voice of his, "You did fine, Mrs. Boone." And then he walked toward the house, leaving her in the golden dust, staring after him with a heart pounding so hard she wasn't sure if it was fear anymore or something else, something warmer, something far more dangerous. Late afternoon settled gently over the ranch, the sky fading from copper to a pale wash of gold. The cottonwood leaves rustled like they were whispering to themselves, and the air grew cool enough that even the chickens quieted down for the evening. Inside the house, a thin thread of smoke curled from the stone fireplace, carrying with it the familiar scent of dry cedar. Silas Boone opened the front door for Nora to step in first. He didn't say anything. He rarely did, but she sensed the unspoken invitation. The house was small and plain, built for function, not show. One main room spread out before her a simple wooden table, 2 chairs that had seen better years, a Bible resting neatly beside a kerosene lamp. And above the mantel, a well-cared-for rifle hanging like a silent guardian. Near the staircase ladder was a loft where a narrow bunk bed waited under a thick quilt. Beside the hearth lay a single rug, woven with muted blues and reds, worn in the middle from years of a man standing alone in front of the fire. Silas cleared his throat lightly. "You can take the small room," he said, nodding toward a door on the right. "I'll sleep in the loft." Nora hesitated. She half expected men out here to assume certain rights, especially after being called someone's wife. But Silas didn't seem to have any interest in claiming anything he hadn't earned. His voice wasn't nervous or soft or pleading, just matter of fact. Like offering the room was as natural as filling a bucket at the well. "Thank you," she whispered. He tipped his hat once, then hung it beside the door. For a moment, neither of them moved. Nora stood there clutching the blanket he'd given her, unsure of what to do with her hands, her body, the space she took up. She had never been in a stranger's home like this, not as a guest. At Crane's property, she had been something else entirely. "I can help," she blurted suddenly, "with supper. If you like." Silas blinked once, slowly, as though trying to decide if that was an offer or an apology. But he stepped aside from the stove. "If you want." She did want, maybe because doing something felt better than standing there feeling like she didn't belong. What followed was less supper-making and more accidental sabotage. The potatoes peeled unevenly, half too thick, half scraped down to nothing. The bacon smoked so heavily that Silas had to open the window before the alarm and his chickens got set off outside. She spilled the coffee grounds twice, first on the stove, then on the floorboards. The kettle hissed angrily when she filled it too high. And somewhere in the process, she managed to burn not just the bacon, but also the pan itself. Through it all, Silas watched quietly, not judging, not sighing, just stepping forward now and then to adjust the stove latch or reach for a clean towel. "You ever cooked before?" he asked after the third minor disaster. She paused. Bacon fork in hand? Not really. That so? I I had chores, she said quickly, but not this kind. Mostly sewing, cleaning, taking trays to the dining room at my stepfather's house. But the cooking was done by, she stopped. Unsure how much of her past she wanted to place on the wooden table between them. Silas didn't press. Stove sticks, he said instead, tapping one of the iron hinges. It ain't your fault. Those 6 words, simple, plain, steady, felt like more grace than she'd been given in years. By the time the food made it to the table, it wasn't pretty, but it was warm. The room filled with the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel, each tick echoing in the quiet between them. Nora sat across from Silas, their chairs angled slightly away, as if both were afraid to face the strangeness directly. She folded her hands in her lap beneath the table, hiding the tremble in her fingers. Silas sliced his potato with precise movements, each cut slow, like he was giving her time to breathe. They ate mostly in silence. The only sounds were the faint pop of burning wood, the soft clink of tin utensils, and the steady hum of the wind nudging the window panes. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. After a while, Silas set down his fork. If we're married, he said, tone even. You ought to know, I snore. Her head shot up, eyes wide. He lifted one hand, thumb pointing toward his boots by the door. And I keep those there so I don't step on nails at night. For a heartbeat, she didn't know what to do with that information. And then, unexpected, unplanned, a laugh escaped her. A rough, startled sound, too loud for the tiny room. She slapped her hand over her mouth, cheeks burning, but it was too late. The sound was out there now, rattling the quiet like a stone tossed into a still pond. Silas didn't smile exactly, but his eyes shifted, their cold blue warming around the edges, like winter sunlight catching on a frozen creek. That's so funny, he asked. She shook her head behind her hand, still half laughing, half mortified. I'm sorry. Her voice softened. I didn't expect you to say that. Silas leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight. Didn't expect to say it. For the first time since she ran from everything she knew. Nora let her shoulders drop, let herself breathe without feeling chased. Let herself feel the house this small, solid place, built by a man who kept his boots by the door and his words tucked tight behind his ribs. Outside, the wind loosened around the cottonwood. A single leaf brushed against the window, tapping softly, as if reminding them both that the world still moved beyond these walls. But inside, something tender hovered between them, new, uncertain, fragile as a match flame, close to comfort. She didn't know yet if she could trust it. She didn't know yet if she could trust him, but for the cup between 2 hands, Nora traced the rim of her tin cup, eyes lowered. The warmth in her chest felt strange, dangerously, first time in a long while. She wasn't afraid of the next breath. And in the quiet of that little house, with the fire crackling low and the clock ticking steady, the ice between 2 lonely strangers cracked just a hairline mark, but enough for the light to slip through. 3 days passed before Silas said they needed to ride into Dry Creek. Supplies were low, floured down to dust, lamp oil nearly gone, and the mare needed new shoes. He saddled the horses early, long shadows stretching across the yard as the sun climbed over the ridge. You can stay here, he told Nora as he tightened the cinch. Be quicker that way. She shook her head before he even finished. I'm coming. You don't have to. I can't be alone, she said. voice barely louder than the breeze. Not yet. Silas paused, then gave a short nod, as if agreeing wasn't kindness but simple logic. All right. Dry Creek lay a little more than 3 miles south, a small town folded between low hills. Its buildings sun-faded and sturdy. As they rode closer, Nora felt her heart thump hard against her ribs. She'd passed through towns before, but never walked in one, with a name attached to her. Not her real name, not yet, but a name nonetheless. And that name, Mrs. Boone, felt heavier than the blanket she clung to the first night. When they reached the edge of town, the blacksmith's hammer was already ringing out in sharp, metallic rhythms. Harlan Briggs lifted his head from the anvil when he spotted Silas. The big man gave a nod, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Boone," Harlan called. "Been a bit. Thought the coyotes got you." Silas grunted. "Not yet." Harlan's eyes flicked to Nora. They softened with a touch of surprise. "Well now, you bring company." Silas didn't answer, and Nora managed a small, polite smile. Harlan gave her a gentler nod than she expected from a man with forearms like carved stone. Farther down the street, the chapel door stood open. Reverend Cole sat on the steps, elbows on his knees, staring at the dust like it held a sermon he hadn't figured out yet. He had tired eyes, kind one's eyes that saw more than he spoke. When Nora passed, he touched the brim of his hat, not staring or prying, just acknowledging. The saloon woke up next. The doors swung outward with a lazy chatter of hinges, revealing Maggie O'Rourke, fiery hair tucked into a loose bun, apron smeared with flour and whiskey stains. She leaned against the doorframe, chewing a toothpick, gaze sharp as a knife's edge. "Well, bless my boots," she drawled. "Silas Boone brings in a lady." Nora stiffened. Silas didn't react, which seemed to amuse Maggie even more. "About time you settled down," Maggie said. "Town's been taking bets on whether you'd die married to your horses." Silas ignored that too. But the town didn't. Curious eyes followed them, a few whispers, soft enough not to be rude, but loud enough to reach Nora's ears. "Silas Boone married. Didn't think he had it in him. Girl looks young. Pretty, though. Poor thing must have drawn the short straw." Nora's face warmed until she thought she might glow. Inside Larkin's general store, the smell of flour, kerosene, and peppermint filled the air. Mrs. Larkin bustled in from the back room, her cheeks rosy, her smile wide as a frying pan. Silas placed a list on the counter: flour, salt, coffee, shoeing nails. Mrs. Larkin barely glanced at the paper before leaning forward, hands clasped. "Well now, Mr. Boone." "Who's this?" Nora opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands twisted in the skirt she wore, fabric she'd washed and hung herself 2 days earlier. Silas answered for her. "My wife, Mrs. Larkin gasped. "Your wife? Oh my, when was the wedding? Why didn't you say something sooner? We'd have baked a cake." Nora felt heat creeping up her neck. She tried to speak again, but the sound tangled. Silas didn't give her time to flounder. "It was a small thing," he said. "Out, under the cottonwood. Not a lie, not really. The only thing they'd shared under that tree was a false name and a borrowed story. But somehow, his voice made it sound like truth. Mrs. Larkin clapped her hands. "Romantic." My Henry never had the sense for that kind of thinking. She bustled around collecting the items while Nora caught her breath. Outside, a few people gathered on the boardwalk, not staring, just watching the way a small town does when news spreads faster than horse hooves. Silas lifted the sack of flour to his shoulder and handed Nora a small tin of nails, as if giving her a task would steady her. That was when Reverend Cole stepped off the chapel steps and approached. Nora's stomach dropped. If anyone would see through her lie, she figured it'd be a man of God. "Morning, Silas," he said. "Reverend." His eyes landed on Nora. She braced herself. Instead of suspicion, she got warmth. "Ma'am," he said gently, "word travels fast around here. Congratulations to you both." Nora felt her throat close. She forced a nod. Reverend Cole continued, "God bless your house, both of you. And if you ever want the vows read proper, my door's open. Any time." Silas inclined his head. Nora stared at the ground because she didn't trust what her face might show. No one had blessed anything in her life for a very long time. The Reverend walked on, leaving them in the warm hush of the street. Nora let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "They believed you," she whispered. Silas adjusted the sack on his shoulder. "People see what they want," he said simply, "and what hurts them least." She wasn't sure what he meant. Maybe she'd ask one day. As they stepped off the boardwalk to head home, Nora glanced back. Dry Creek wasn't big, but it felt like 1,000 eyes had watched her walk its dirt road. And somehow, instead of turning away, the town had opened its gate a little enough for her to slip inside their story. For now. But belonging, she knew, was a fragile thing. One good wind could scatter it. She followed Silas toward the horses, a soft, unfamiliar warmth in her chest. Part hope, part fear, part something nameless that kept growing every time she walked beside him. And as they mounted up to ride back into the Nevada dust, she wondered how long this borrowed life could hold before the truth came pounding on their door again. Night fell hard over the Nevada plain, the kind of night that pressed its cold palms against every window pane. The wind slid across the boards like a restless spirit, making the shutters rattle faintly with each gust. Inside Silas Boone's cabin, the only light came from a low-burning oil lamp and the small fire crackling behind the grate, its glow dancing across the walls. Nora sat close to the hearth, legs pulled beneath her, blanket draped around her shoulders. She watched the flames shift and snap, as if they were trying to say something she couldn't quite hear. Silas sat at the table, mending a cinch strap with slow, careful motions. He hadn't said much since they returned from town, just checked the horses, stacked the supplies, and put water to boil. That was his way, doing more than speaking. Nora found she didn't mind the quiet as much as she used to. For a long stretch, there was only the fire and the wind. Then she spoke. "My stepfather wasn't always cruel," she began softly, her eyes fixed on the flames. "But once the mining debt hit, once the cards turned against him, something in him changed." Silas didn't lift his head, but she knew he was listening. Crane came the first time with a smile. She continued. "Said he knew a way to settle things without trouble. Said I'd do well working in his house, help in the kitchens, sweep, serve meals." My stepfather acted like it was an honor. Nora swallowed, fingers tightening on the blanket. The second time he came, he brought a contract. I wasn't in the room when they signed it. I heard the quill scratching from the hallway. I was supposed to be sewing. But I heard my name. Her breath wavered. I never touched that paper, but I was written into it, as payment. She paused, letting the fire fill the silence. "The first bruise," she said quietly, "wasn't from my stepfather. It was Crane. He grabbed my arm too hard when I didn't pour his drink fast enough." Her voice steadied, almost as if recounting it dulled the pain rather than sharpened it. "After that, I stopped going outside alone, stopped sleeping with the door unlatched. stopped hoping my stepfather would see me. Silas set down the leather strap, still didn't interrupt, still didn't offer empty comforts. Just let her words sit where they landed. Nora drew a shaky breath. When they locked the shackle on my wrist before putting me in Crane's wagon, I knew if I didn't run then, I never would. The wind moaned against the window. Silas remained silent, his stillness a kind of shelter she hadn't known she needed. After a moment, Nora turned slightly, watching him in the dim glow. His profile looked carved from old stone, strong, unmovable, but his eyes were softer, the way embers are soft before they flare. "You listen like you're used to hearing hard things," she murmured. Silas didn't answer right away. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had when choosing his words. Finally, Nora nodded toward the army jacket hanging from its peg by the wall. "Who did you lose?" Silas's hand stilled. His jaw shifted once. Then he let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "I rode remounts for the Union cavalry," he said, voice steady but distant. "Didn't sign up out of pride, just needed the pay. Figured horses made more sense than men." Nora waited. "War's loud," he continued, "loud and messy. People get caught in it who don't deserve to. I saw homes burned on orders, barns torched, families driven out. Folks running with what they could carry." He paused, staring at the knot in the tabletop. "Didn't question much back then. Wasn't my place, or so I thought." The fire popped sharply, as if reacting to the weight of his memory. "One night," Silas said, voice dropping to something almost hollow, "we got word of a Confederate patrol, small group, moving through the trees. Command said take them out, no questions." His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "It was dark," he said. "Real dark. You shoot at shapes, at shadows, at whatever moves. It's chaos. Horses screaming, men yelling, smoke everywhere." Nora's heart clenched. "The next morning," Silas said, "I went to check the bodies. One of them." His throat worked. "One of them was my brother." Nora didn't breathe. Didn't know he'd joined the Confederacy. Didn't know he was even in the territory. His voice cracked, not loudly, just enough to sound human, wounded in a place no doctor could stitch. "And I was the one who pulled the trigger." He shut his eyes briefly, the pain surfacing then sinking again beneath years of grit. "After the war ended, I came out here," he said. "Figured the land doesn't ask who you were, just what you'll do today." The room fell quiet, not the hollow quiet from before, but something deeper, something shared. Nora stood slowly and walked toward him. When she reached his side, she hesitated just a breath before placing her hand lightly on his forearm. Her fingers barely touched him, soft as the brush of a leaf. "You didn't know," she whispered. Silas didn't pull away. His muscles stayed taut beneath her touch. But he didn't move. "And today?" she said, voice trembling but resolute. "You're the man who kept me from being dragged back to hell." For the first time, Silas met her eyes fully. No barriers, no retreat. Just two bruised souls staring at each other across a flickering fire. The wind pressed once more against the window, but inside, the world was still. The touch of her hand remained uncertain, fragile, honest. Dry Creek woke under a strange kind of tension that morning, the kind that leaves the air feeling taut, like a rope pulled too tight. Smoke rose from the chimneys as usual, but it drifted sideways in a restless wind, smearing across the sky like a warning no one wanted to read. News traveled fast in small towns, but bad news, that traveled like wildfire. Elias Crane had arrived just after sunrise. His wagon rolled straight up to the saloon, team of glossy horses snorting in the crisp air. He stepped down, wearing a coat far too fine for this dusty place, the kind stitched by hands that had never touched soil. He bought the first round of drinks for every man inside and made sure the sheriff saw him do it. By noon, half the town had already heard his story. Girls stole from him, ran off with jewelry and cash. Poor man's only trying to get his property back. Property. The word hung over Dry Creek like smoke. Around noon, the first handbill went up. Not a proper wanted poster, no seal, no fort signature, just a cheap, quickly printed paper nailed to the saloon post. It read, "Reward for return of runaway girl. Barefoot, dark hair, scar on wrist, stolen silver locket." Maggie O'Rourke was sweeping her porch when she saw it. Her broom stopped mid-swing. She stared at the handbill long enough for her jaw to lock. Then she ripped it down with a snarl that could have sent cattle running. "Low-life bastard," she muttered, shredding the paper and tossing it into the dirt. But more were already up on the general store wall, near the smithy, even pinned to a fence post near the chapel. Maggie tore down 2 more, but the wind had already carried the story further than her hands could reach. Reverend Cole found Crane outside the sheriff's office, leaning against a post like he owned the place. "That paper is a lie," the Reverend said, quietly. Crane smiled without warmth. "Truth's what people believe, Reverend. And right now, they believe me. You know she didn't steal anything." Crane shrugged, adjusting his gloves. "The law's about claims. I'm claiming what's mine. The fort listens to men with influence. And I've got plenty." The Reverend's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. He simply walked away, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of knowing justice on the frontier wasn't always blind. Sometimes it looked straight at money. That afternoon, Silas and Nora rode into town to pick up a new girth strap Harlan had finished. The moment their horses stepped onto Main Street, conversations dimmed. Eyes followed them, curious, wary, some sympathetic, others sharp with judgment. Nora felt each stare like a needle. Silas kept his posture straight, calm, but the muscle in his jaw ticked. He tied the horses to the post outside the smithy and helped Nora dismount, his hand lingering half a second longer than usual. Harlan stepped out of the forge, wiping his hands on a rag. "Boone." He nodded. Then, more gently, "Ma'am?" Nora tried to smile. She never saw the handbill on the fence until after Silas took 2 steps forward. She froze. Silas felt her stop and turned. Her eyes were fixed on the paper fluttering in the afternoon wind. Her description, her scar, and the lie about theft. Nora's stomach dropped so fast she had to grip the fence rail to stay upright. Silas tore the handbill free with one tug. He didn't crumple it, didn't stomp it. He just folded it once, neatly, like he was filing away a threat he already planned to deal with. "That locket," Nora whispered. "He's calling it stolen." Silas didn't answer. Answering would have meant giving the lie weight. People along the boardwalk watched, whispering in low, buzzing currents. Nora felt her skin flush hot, shame rising, even though she'd done nothing wrong. It was the weight of being talked about, of being publicly claimed by a past she no longer wanted. The sheriff finally approached. Sheriff Alden was a tired man, stretched between what was right and what was convenient. He stopped a few paces from Silas, hat in hand. "Boone," he said slowly, "we need to talk." Silas said nothing, only shifted slightly so he stood between Nora and the sheriff. Alden rubbed the brim of his hat. Crane's making noise up at the fort. Says he's got a paper claim. Says the girl stole from him. You know how this works, the fort's laws thin out here, and men like him, they tend to sway things. Nora's breath hitched, Silas's eyes darkened, but he kept them steady on the sheriff. Alden continued quietly, almost apologetic. I know Crane's a bully. I know he's twisting things. But if the fort decides to back him, I might have to come for her. He paused, voice low and heavy. You understand. Silas didn't nod, didn't speak, but something in his posture sharpened, like a blade scraping a whetstone. Boone, the sheriff said again, I'm not saying I want to. I'm saying I may not get a choice. Silas turned slightly, placing one broad, steady hand on the small of Nora's back. Then we're done here, he said, not angry, not loud, just final. He guided Nora away from the sheriff, away from the whispers, away from the nailed-up lies flapping against the wind. Nora walked beside him, trembling not from fear this time, but from the force of how tightly he kept her close. She didn't speak until they reached the horses. Silas, she whispered. He helped her mount, eyes scanning the street as though calculating every danger it held. We'll handle it, he said. How she didn't know. But the way he said it made her believe for one impossible moment that maybe the whole world wasn't as strong as this man's quiet resolve. As they rode out of Dry Creek, the handbills fluttered behind them like ghosts, whispering a warning that the frontier held long memories. And Crane wasn't done yet. The wind changed around midnight. Nora felt it before she woke the shift of air sliding under the windowsill, cold and restless, rattling the shutters in an uneven rhythm. The cottonwood outside shivered, its branches brushing the house like long fingers, warning of something unseen. She blinked, eyes adjusting to the dark. Then came the glow, faint at first, orange, flickering, pulsing like a heartbeat against the far wall. Nora sat up fast. That wasn't lamplight. It wasn't dawn. It was smoke. She smelled it a breath, later sharp, acrid, unmistakable. She threw off her blanket and ran to the window. What she saw froze her pulse. The barn, Silas's barn, the place she had first collapsed into, the place that had kept her alive. It was burning. Flames licked up the dry boards like hungry tongues, climbing fast toward the rafters. The horses screamed inside high, panicked, desperate. Silas, she shouted, sprinting for the door. He was already there, boots half-laced, shirt thrown on, eyes blazing with a fear she'd never seen in him. He grabbed the water bucket without hesitation. Stay back, he ordered. Nora didn't even consider obeying. The night erupted in heat as they burst outside. Sparks leapt from the barn roof, lighting the darkness with angry flashes. The wind fed the fire, blowing glowing embers across the yard like fireflies from hell. Silas sprinted for the trough, dunked the bucket deep, and ran straight into the blaze. Nora followed, her skirt whipping around her legs. She plunged another bucket into the trough, water splashing up her arms, and ran beside him. The first wave of heat struck her so hard she staggered, but she kept going. Throw it low, Silas barked over the roar. Keep the flames from climbing. She obeyed, though her hands shook so badly the water sloshed over her wrists. The horses' screams tore through the night. Nora felt each one like a blade. She rushed to the barn door, yanking with all her strength, coughing as smoke clawed down her throat. Silas heaved the door open with one violent pull. Inside, chaos. Flames danced across the rafters. Hay smoldered, A broken lantern lay shattered in the corner, glass glowing red hot. "Who did this?" Silas shouted through clenched teeth. Nora didn't answer. They both knew. Crane, or his men. Silas shoved her backward. "Get out, I'll get the horses." Another scream, one horse, kicking wildly in the far stall. "No," Nora cried. "You can't." But Silas was already inside, vanishing into the thick smoke. Her heart lurched. Without thinking, she dropped her empty bucket and ran after him, skirts dragging through the wet dirt, boots slipping. The fire crackled overhead, raining sparks that stung her scalp. Nora Silas roared when he saw her. "I told you." A beam gave a long, sick groan. Then it fell. The world flashed orange as the beam crashed down beside Silas, pinning his leg under its weight. He gasped, jaw clenched, fire spitting up around him. Nora screamed his name and sprinted through the smoke. Heat clawed at her face, stealing her breath, but she dropped to her knees beside him. "Get out," he shouted. "Get out now." She didn't move. Instead, she grabbed a broken plank from the floor, jammed it under the fallen beam, and threw her weight onto it. Her palms burned. The plank bent, creaked, nearly snapped. She screamed from exertion. "Come on," she begged. "Come on." Silas braced himself as the beam lifted just enough. He yanked his leg free, grunting through the pain. "Move." He barked, grabbing her arm. They stumbled to the far stall together. The last horse, a terrified roan, kicked at the door. Silas shoved it open, slapped the horse's flank hard, sending it bolting out of the burning barn into the night. The flames behind them suddenly surged upward, the roof groaning like a dying creature. Silas Nora started. He didn't let her finish. He scooped his arm around her and hauled her toward the exit, just as a section of the roof collapsed behind them with a thunderous crash. They burst out into the yard, hitting the cold air like a fist to the lungs. Both collapsed in the mud, coughing until their ribs ached, soot streaking their faces and hair. Rain, thin and hesitant at first, began to fall, hissing as it touched the burning boards. They lay there, breathing hard, staring up at the smoke twisting into the night sky. Finally, Nora turned her head toward him. "You could have let it burn," she whispered hoarsely. "Saved yourself." Silas wiped soot from his brow with the back of his hand. "You ran in there too." "That's different. No," he said quietly, with a rough laugh. "Maybe I'm not the only fool in this house." She smiled small, shaky, tired. The barn crackled behind them, flames dying now as the rain gathered strength. The horses milled in the yard, snorting, confused but alive. Nora let out a long breath. She knew what he meant. He knew she knew. Their shared foolishness wasn't foolish at all. It was the closest thing to love either had dared to show, and neither of them was ready to say it. So the night said it for them in the falling rain, in the mud on their clothes, in the scorch marks on Silas's boots, and the raw skin on Nora's palms, where the plank had burned her. They stayed there a while longer, breathing smoke and storm air, two survivors lying in the wet dirt, tied together by the fire that almost took them, and the fire inside them that neither dared name. Morning broke gray and silent, the kind of morning that didn't quite feel like a beginning. Rain from the night before had soaked the ground, leaving the yard soft, the air heavy with the scent of wet ash. What remained of the barn still smoldered blackened beams, leaning like broken ribs against the sky. Nora stood at the window, fingers pressed to the cold glass. She hadn't slept. The fire had taken too much of Silas's livelihood, of everything safe, of everything quiet. And something in her told her the fire wasn't the end. It was only the first knock. Around mid-morning, she heard it. Hoofbeats, slow, steady, too many to be a search party, too disciplined to be Crane's men. Silas stepped out onto the porch. He wore no hat, no weapons strapped to his side, just the plain, soot-stained shirt from the night before. Nora followed, standing just behind him, hands trembling at her sides. Down the road, through the thinning mist, came 10 bluecoats, soldiers from the outpost. Their uniforms were dusty, but their rifles were polished. A lieutenant rode at the front, posture stiff, eyes already set on the ranch. Sheriff Alden rode beside them, hat pulled low, and behind them, sitting too proud in a polished wagon, was Elias Crane, smug, smiling, certain. The riders halted near the fence. The lieutenant dismounted, boots sinking into the wet ground. He unfolded a stack of papers with the satisfaction of a man who believed ink could bend anyone to his will. Silas Boone, he called. Silas didn't move. Lieutenant, we've come for the girl. Nora flinched. Silas angled himself slightly in front of her, barely perceptible, but enough to shield her from the direct line of the lieutenant's stare. The soldier lifted the papers. Evidence of theft. A signed contract for her labor. Statements from local witnesses confirming she fled with stolen property. Crane cleared his throat, loud enough to draw attention. My property, he added, like a man talking about a horse he'd misplaced. Silas's jaw tightened. His rifle stood inside the doorway, just behind him close enough to grab. The lieutenant's eyes flicked toward it. Don't, he warned. Raise that weapon, and this stops being a civil matter. Nora stepped forward without thinking. I didn't steal anything. That locket Crane cut in belonged to my mother. She took it. That's a lie, Nora snapped. Crane shrugged, oily and calm. Paper says otherwise. Witnesses say otherwise. Bought witnesses, Reverend Cole muttered as he stepped forward from the crowd forming behind the soldiers. No one had noticed him arrive, but there he stood, raincoat dripping, eyes stern. The lieutenant didn't even glance at him. Miss, you will come with us to the outpost. There the case will be heard. Nora's breath shook. She turned to Silas. If I go with them, I won't come back. You know that? Silas didn't speak, didn't have to. The truth was written deep in his eyes. The lieutenant lifted a hand toward his men. Take her, before they could move. Silas stepped down from the porch, planting himself in the muddy yard, between the soldiers and Nora. You'll go through me first, he said. Rifles cocked instantly. A dozen metal clicks slicing the air. Boone, Sheriff Alden said, sharply, don't do this. But Silas didn't look at the sheriff. He stared straight at the lieutenant. You know she's telling the truth. The lieutenant's face remained cold. Truth isn't my business. Paper is. Nora grabbed Silas's arm. Don't, she whispered urgently. Please. They'll kill you. They'll kill you for nothing. Silas swallowed, throat working. His hand twitched once near his side, toward the door, toward the rifle he could reach in one desperate second. He looked at Nora. The fear in her eyes cut deeper than any blade. And Silas Boone, who had survived war, loss, guilt, fire finally broke, not in anger, in surrender. He slowly raised his hands. The soldiers hesitated. Nora's voice cracked. Silas! What are you doing? What I have to, he murmured. If this is going to court, I'll stand there too. The lieutenant stiffened. You're admitting to harboring a fugitive. Silas gave a bitter half-smile. Ain't harboring when someone's freezing on your floor. But if you want to call it that, I won't argue. Nora's breath caught. You don't owe me this. Silas looked at her, then really looked, not as a runaway, not as a burden, but as the one person whose safety mattered more than his pride or freedom. Maybe I do, he said quietly. The soldiers moved in. Two grabbed Silas's arms, binding his wrists with iron cuffs that clinked sharply in the still morning air. He didn't resist, didn't even flinch. Nora reached for him, but Crane stepped in front of her, blocking her path with a smile that made her stomach twist. Don't worry, little dove, Crane crooned. You'll be next. Silas turned his head sharply at that, but he didn't fight. Not yet. Not here. Not with rifles pointed at him, and Nora standing vulnerable in the open. As the soldiers led him toward the wagon, Nora felt her knees weaken. The world blurred through hot, helpless tears she refused to let fall. Silas, she called. He looked back once. Just once. His eyes held everything he couldn't say with his hands bound. Don't break. I'd do it again. Stay alive. I'm not done protecting you. Then he was pushed forward, boots sinking into the mud as the law rode in not to deliver justice, but to claim the man who had dared to stand between a girl and her past. Dry Creek felt different the morning after the arrest, quieter, as if every window, every porch board, every horse hitched along Main Street knew something wrong had settled over the town. Not danger, not yet, but injustice. Then, cold, creeping at the edges, Nora sat on the edge of a narrow bed in Mrs. Larkin's back room, hands folded hard in her lap. The room smelled of lavender soap and starch, the kind of scent meant to comfort travelers. But she wasn't a traveler, not anymore. And this wasn't a refuge, it was a polite cell. Mrs. Larkin had been kind, brought her tea, insisted she rest. Dear, but the lock on the outside of the door told the truth. No one spoke aloud. The sheriff had said it was for her protection. Nora had heard that phrase too many times in her life to trust it. Protection, in a man's mouth, usually meant control. Silas was somewhere on the other side of Dry Creek, held in a makeshift stockade near the outpost, behind a wall of soldiers and orders. She pictured him sitting alone, head bowed, wrists raw from the cuffs, a man who had survived battles, fire, grief, now jailed for choosing kindness. The unfairness of it pressed on her chest until she couldn't breathe. She needed air. She needed space. She needed something holy, even if she wasn't sure she believed in holy things anymore. When Mrs. Larkin left to fetch fresh water, Nora slipped out, not running, just walking with purpose down the narrow hallway, through the kitchen, and out the back door before anyone noticed. Dry Creek's chapel sat at the far end of town, its steeple short and plain, its paint peeling in long strips, no stained glass windows, no carved stone, just timber walls, a creaking roof, and a bell rope that had frayed from years of hard winters. Inside, Reverend Cole was sweeping, each slow stroke echoing in the quiet room. He didn't look surprised to see her. Morning, Miss Elridge, he said softly. Nora stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a tired sigh. Candles flickered in small clay holders along the wall, their flames trembling in the draught. Is it always this quiet? She asked. Cole leaned the broom against a pew. Only when folks don't know what to pray for. Nora moved farther down the aisle, fingers brushing the back of each wooden pew. They were smooth from years of hands, some hopeful, some scared, some guilty. She sat near the front. The Reverend waited, giving her space to speak first. But the words took time. "I don't know why I'm here," she admitted. "You came because silence tells the truth better than shouting," Cole said gently. Her throat tightened. "I'm tired, Reverend." His eyes softened. "Of running. Of being told I'm something I'm not." She pulled her hands together, clutching her fingers tight. Debt, property, a contract, a problem, a girl who needs returning. Her voice cracked. "No one asks me who I am." Cole didn't interrupt. He just folded his hands and listened, as though every word mattered. Nora stared at the simple wooden cross above the pulpit. "I used to think God watched over us. My mama believed it. She prayed every night." She swallowed. "But after she died, nothing felt protected. Not me. Not home. Not the pieces she left behind." "What did she leave?" Cole asked softly. "A locket." Nora's voice shrank to a whisper. "He's calling it stolen. It's the only thing I have of her, and the only thing I've ever truly owned." Cole nodded slowly, letting silence settle again. After a long moment, he asked, "What about Silas Boone?" Nora looked up sharply. "What about him? You've spoken of everyone else defining you. Tell me, what does he make you feel like?" Her breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest, surprised by how quickly the answer rose. She looked down at the floor, trying to steady her voice. "He never asked for anything, never demanded, never bargained. He didn't even ask who I was before helping me." She blinked hard. "He just made space for me, as if I had a right to choose where I stood." Cole's voice remained quiet. "And when he told those men you were his wife," Nora inhaled sharply, remembering it, the steady weight of his hand, the calm in his voice, the impossible courage of the lie. For the first time, she whispered, "I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if it was pretend." Cole's expression warmed, not with judgment, but with understanding. Sometimes a truth can be spoken before it's fully lived. Doesn't make it less true. Nora turned, meeting the Reverend's gaze. "He's in chains because of me." "He chose that," Cole replied. "Chose it with clear eyes. I don't want him to pay for my life." "Then what will you do?" Cole asked. That question settled in the quiet chapel, like a stone dropped into a still pond. Nora lifted her chin. She felt the answer before she spoke it. It rose from a place so deep inside her, she hadn't known it was waiting. "When the judge asks who I am," she swallowed hard, "I won't let Crane answer. I won't let the papers answer. I won't let the sheriff, or the lieutenant, or my stepfather answer." Her voice strengthened, steadier than she expected. "I will say who I am." Reverend Cole nodded once, slowly, like a man witnessing a small miracle. "Then that is your prayer," he said. "Not words to God, but a promise to yourself." Nora let out a trembling breath. "Will it matter?" "It always matters," Cole replied. "Truth spoken by the right person at the right time can turn a whole room." She looked toward the chapel door. The sky outside was heavy with gray. Somewhere, out there, Silas waited for judgment he didn't deserve. "When the time comes," Cole added softly, "don't let fear speak. Let truth do it." Nora stood. Her hands no longer shook. She stepped out of the chapel into the cold daylight, unsure of what the judge would say, or what the law would do. But for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she would say. And that was enough to send a shiver through her, not of fear, but of something almost like strength. The territorial courthouse didn't look like a place where lives were decided. It was a plain wooden building, 2 stories if one counted the cramped attic. Its boards, bleached pale by sun and wind, But today, it felt heavier, like the weight of everyone's breath had settled into the rafters. People packed every bench. The room smelled of dust, wool coats, and anticipation. Maggie O'Rourke stood near the back, arms crossed tight. Harlan Briggs took off his hat and held it respectfully against his chest. Reverend Cole sat in the second row, eyes steady, hands clasped. The sheriff hovered near the wall, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. Crane arrived with a lawyer in a tailored vest, both of them polished like polished boots. Soldiers lined the walls, blue coats stiff and watchful. And at the front stood Silas Boone, wrists freed, but flanked by soldiers, calm but not resigned, steady, but carrying the quiet weight of a man who believed this might be his last sunrise as a free soul. Nora saw him as she entered from the side door. Her heart stumbled in her chest. He looked different in the courtroom light cleaner, sharper, like every shadow had been scraped off him except the ones inside his eyes. He met her gaze only once, briefly, as if to say, "You don't have to do this." But she did. The judge, a lean man with graying hair and the expression of someone permanently unimpressed, called the room to order. The territory of Nevada versus Silas Boone, he said, voice even. Charges include harboring a fugitive, obstructing lawful retrieval, and abetting theft. Crane's lawyer rose with a flourish, waving papers as though they were holy scripture. He spoke smoothly, confidently about contracts, labor agreements, obligations, Nora's instability, her tendency to mislead, and Crane's gracious patience as a benefactor wronged. He presented the handbill with pride, as though it were a badge of honor instead of a lie scribbled in haste. Nora felt the room shift, eyes on her, some sympathetic, some suspicious. Then the judge said her name, Nora Elridge. Step forward. The aisle felt longer than the street outside. Her steps sounded too loud, echoing between wooden pews. But she didn't falter. She walked straight to the stand, chin lifted, fingers clasped tightly together. The judge folded his hands. "Miss Elridge, were you taken against your will by this man?" He pointed slightly toward Silas, "or compelled to flee unlawfully?" "No, Your Honor," Nora answered. Her voice surprised her, steady, anchored. "I ran of my own will." A soft ripple passed through the spectators. The judge continued. "Did you, in fact, steal property from Mr. Crane?" "No." Her hand went to her chest. "The locket is mine," she breathed in. "My mother's name is inscribed inside. If you wish, I can show it." Crane tensed visibly at that. The lawyer cleared his throat. "And did Silas Boone mislead the community?" The judge pressed, "By claiming you were his wife." Nora inhaled slowly. "No," she said. "He didn't mislead anyone. He protected me." Another murmur, this one louder. She turned then, not toward the judge, but toward the room. "When those men came to take me, he stood between them and me. He didn't ask questions. He didn't claim a debt. He didn't bargain like Mr. Crane. He just put a blanket around my shoulders and helped me breathe." Crane scoffed, but she kept going. "He called me his wife to keep them from dragging me back, and in my heart," her voice trembled but didn't break. "From that moment, I was—" Silas shut his eyes for half a second, as though the words struck something deep. The room held its breath before the judge could respond. A voice rose from the back. "Your Honor," it said, "permission to speak." An older soldier stepped forward. His uniform was faded, sleeve-patched. His face was lined with years of sun and grief. Sergeant Hale. Few noticed him earlier, just another veteran leaning against the wall. The judge squinted. "Do you have standing here?" Sergeant, I rode with Silas Boone during the war, Hale said. That gives me standing in any room where his character's questioned. The judge, taken aback but curious, nodded. Proceed. Hale walked down the aisle with a slow, deliberate limp. He stopped beside the railing near Silas. I won't pretend Boone's an easy man, Hale said. He's stubborn as an ox, quiet as a grave, and carries guilt like a pack mule. Maggie snorted softly. But I saw him once. Refuse an order that would have burned a farmhouse with people inside, women and children. Hale continued. He took a whipping for it, a bad one. Took it without a word because he believed doing right mattered more than wearing stripes. The courtroom shifted again. A deeper murmur. Hale placed a hand on the rail. I'd trust him with my back, with my land. He paused, voice roughening. With my daughter. Silas swallowed hard. His eyes shone faintly, though no one but Nora noticed. The judge leaned back, silent for a long moment. Then, this court finds no evidence of theft, he said at last. Crane's face twisted. And Miss Elridge is of age. No contract signed or not can bind her person. The law of this territory recognizes no man's claim over her body. Nora felt something inside her loosen, like a knot slowly untying. As for the question of marriage, the judge let his eyes sweep over the room. Reverend Cole, Maggie, Harlan, the sheriff. Every one of them had accepted the story, protected it, even believed it. In this territory, he said, a man and woman living as husband and wife, recognized by their community, may be considered married at common law. He glanced at Silas. Do you contest that, Mr. Boone? Silas's voice came low, steady. No, Your Honor, I do not. The judge nodded once. Then this court finds no cause to hold either Silas Boone or Nora Boone. He used the name deliberately. The name rang through the room like a bell, not loud, not grand, but unmistakably final. Nora closed her eyes as the weight lifted slowly, like a storm breaking at last. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Not for either of them. Weeks had passed since the fire, since the courthouse, since the nights of endless fear. The barn had been rebuilt, scorched timbers replaced, walls straight and strong, but one charred post remained, blackened and stubborn, a reminder of what had come before. It leaned slightly, like it, too, had survived a storm and learned humility. The cottonwood tree above it was bare now, stripped of leaves by the early winter, its roots deep, clutching the soil with patient strength. It stood as if waiting for the people who had finally learned to stand beside it. Nora and Silas stood beneath its skeletal branches, the dusk settling around them like a soft, copper-colored blanket. Around them, a handful of townsfolk had gathered. Maggie O'Rourke, arms crossed but smiling, Harlan Briggs, hat in hand, Sheriff Alden, posture eased now, Reverend Cole with the quiet authority of someone who had seen hearts shift and understood that law and love are sometimes separate, and Sergeant Hale, eyes crinkled in an almost shy grin. They were witnesses not to a ceremony of necessity, but to one of choice. Reverend Cole stepped forward with a small leather-bound book. He read in his steady, calm voice words, stripped of grandeur, but heavy with meaning. Do you take this person, freely and with your full heart, to share life's days, its joys and storms, by your side? Silas's voice shook the first time he answered, I take you as my wife. Not because he had to protect her now, not because paper or law demanded it, but because he wanted her to stay. Because he wanted to be seen, fully, vulnerably, honestly. Nora's eyes glistened in the dying light. I chose you the day you told me to stand by you. Today I just say it out loud. Reverend Cole smiled faintly, the briefest flicker of humor in his calm demeanor. The crowd exhaled quietly, as if releasing held breaths from weeks of tension. Harlan approached with a small velvet pouch. He lifted 2 rings, hammered and formed from an old horseshoe in his forge behind the general store, simple, sturdy, with the warmth of metal, shaped by hands that understood life's weight. They slipped them onto each other's fingers, small clinks of iron, a promise not written on paper, not enforced by any law, but sealed in choice and trust. After the vows, they gathered around a small table, coffee steamed in tin cups, bread still warm from Maggie's oven, a little fiddle tune rising from the corner where a boy practiced, trying to match the rhythm of the fire crackling in the hearth. Maggie leaned toward Harlan, whispering loud enough for those nearest to hear. Finally, the giant cowboy comes to his senses. Everyone laughed, including Nora and Silas, the sound low and easy, spilling into the night air like liquid warmth. Later, Nora sat by the hearth in the cabin, a stray child from town perched on the rug before her. The girl's small hands fumbled over letters on the page, while Nora's own fingers guided them, patient and sure. Laughter and soft corrections flowed between them, a rhythm that made the cabin feel less like a shelter from danger and more like home. Outside, Silas rode along the fence lines, boots heavy on the stirrups, eyes scanning the horizon. But, unlike before, he glanced back often, knowing someone waited on the porch with a blanket, a steady gaze, and a smile that could rival the sunset itself. In the evening, they rode together, side by side, across the open Nevada plains. The house stood behind them, small, steadfast, built of timber, stone, and the invisible mortar of shared trials. The wind whipped at their faces, dust curling behind hooves, but they rode slowly, deliberately, no words needed. Each knew the other was there. Each trusted the other's presence like the ground beneath the horse's hooves. As the sun sank low, casting the hills in molten gold, they paused beneath the cottonwood. Its bare branches creaked gently, whispering against the wind. They dismounted, tying the horses together, and stood silently for a long moment. The land stretched wide, forgiving, and utterly indifferent to the troubles of men and women, to contracts, to debts, to the greedy and the cruel. But under that leaning cottonwood tree, they had carved a space no law, no money, no threat could touch, a place defined by choice, by courage, and by the slow, steady heartbeat of 2 people who had finally stopped running. Nora lifted her eyes to Silas. He reached for her hand, thumb brushing the back of her fingers. No grand speeches, no demands, no papers, no guns, no witnesses, beyond those who had already learned to see truth. Just 2 people, steady, side by side, watching the wind stir the dust along the road they would walk together. And the world seemed to pause, letting them take it all in. Out here on the edge of everything, a runaway girl stopped running, a giant cowboy stopped hiding. And under a leaning cottonwood tree, they found a place where no paper, no gun, and no man with money could tell them who they were anymore. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, in a quiet barn at the edge of the plains, in the hands of someone who doesn't ask for your story, only offers you space to survive. Nora and Silas remind us that courage is not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it is simply showing up, protecting what is fragile, and allowing another person to breathe in safety. Trust, once broken by the world, can be rebuilt slowly through small acts of care and quiet understanding. The bonds that grow from those moments silent, steadfast, unannounced, carry more weight than the loud declarations or the power of paper and law. It is in these choices, in the decision to stand with another despite risk or fear, that true freedom and belonging are found. In the end, it is not wealth, title, or control that shapes a life worth living. It is the courage to see someone fully, to respect their right to choose, and to walk beside them when the storms come. And sometimes, the most profound victories are the ones that happen without applause, beneath the leaning branches of a solitary tree, in the quiet knowing that two people found a place where neither had to run anymore. Thank you for being here with us. Every story we tell is a quiet invitation to pause, to feel, and to remember the courage, kindness, and humanity that often go unnoticed. Your presence matters, and every like, share, and subscribe helps us bring more stories from the edge of the frontier tales that honor the heart, the struggles, and the gentle triumphs of people who once walked these lands. Thank you for letting us share these moments with you, and for keeping the spirit of compassion alive in every view and every listen. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul.